This is a test. Algorithm 9. Algorithm number 9. Algo 9. Algo 9. Algo 9. Algorithm 9. Thank you for tuning in for today's episode of Stranger Than Fiction. And this particular video is actually going to be done in 4 parts, and this is part 1 of a 4-part series. So some of you might know that I've been doing some videos recently researching Greg Hallett. Some people might know as King John III. I've been collaborating with Stan Barabas on some videos in regards to this subject where we're trying to share our information and research and trying to establish truth. And in doing so, we ran across an author, historian by the name of Ralph Ellis. We wanted to have a conversation with Ralph, talk about his work, highlight some of his books, and also talk about how some of this might parallel with Greg Hallett. There's a lot of interesting similarities. So some of the books that Ralph Ellis has written include titles like Cleopatra to Christ, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, Jesus, King of Edessa, and the Grail Cypher. He also has books about Mary Magdalene, Skoda, the Egyptian queen of the Scots. So he's definitely in the same area of history and religion as somebody that we wanted to talk to and be able to verify some of this information. We definitely felt it was very interesting. Ultimately, this is over 3.5 hours of content, which is the reason why we decided to break it up into 4 parts. We also wanted to make sure that we had all 4 parts available immediately, so that if somebody wanted to continue watching part 2 and 3 and 4 beyond part 1, which this is what this is, that you would be able to do that in a timely manner and not have to wait for the videos to be uploaded. So with all that being said, if this just happens to be your first time ever watching any of my videos, I do encourage you to explore my channel. If you like what I'm doing, make sure you subscribe. If you like this video, make sure you smash that like button. I encourage you to hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date with my videos as they come out. Also, check out my Patreon channel where you can support me directly and I post up exclusive content. Also, follow me on Library where I post up extra videos. And I'm going to have links down below for both. And we're just going to go ahead and get right into part number 1 of a 4-part video series with Ralph Ellis and Stan Barabas. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in for the continuing show with Rice and Barabas. Today, we are going to be joined, as you see, by an author and historian. His name is Ralph Ellis, and his work has been brought to my attention by Stan, and I've had a chance to look into Ralph's work. And Ralph, you've got some really interesting books. As a historian and a religious scholar, man, you seem to have done a really great job in your research. And as me and Stan have been looking into Greg Hallett and his situation and trying to establish some truth, we saw some parallels with some of the things that Greg was saying in some of his documents to prove his claims. And we wanted to kind of discuss how those parallels worked out. But before we kind of get into the Greg Hallett stuff, I'd love to, in your words, kind of give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to both our audiences and everybody who's watching this video, because I think that your work is very what's the word that I'm looking for? You've got a great body of work, and it just doesn't seem to be getting the attention it deserves. So I would like to bring some attention
I think
to your
that
work.
sometimes as well. Yeah, I've been at this for 45 years. Well, very slowly 45 years ago. I started this when I was probably about 14. I wrote my first chapter just for fun, basically. It never got published, of course. And that sort of was an interest for a long, long time. And then I started publishing 25 years ago. And since then, I've published 12 books, mostly on revisionist theology, so Old Testament and New Testament, looking for these characters in the historical record, because I'm working from an agnostic atheist point of view. So I'm just looking for the real history. I have no real dog in this fight at all. And I just could not believe that you could have this, as it were, history, and all of these characters are missing from the historical record. You've only got two choices. Either the whole thing is fictional and it's a load of rubbish, or perhaps we're not looking at it in the right perspective, and that's why we can't find these people, because none of these characters are visible in the historical record, all the way from the beginning, you know, from Adam and Eve and Jacob and Joseph and Abraham, all the way through to the united monarchy of David and Solomon. They're not visible in the historical record either. And then you go through to obviously the New Testament and Jesus and Saul and all of the other characters of the New Testament. None of them are visible in the historical record.
That's
which
strange,
is,
isn't it?
yeah, it's untenable. If you want to present that as a, you know, a history, a religion, it's complete nonsense, because it does not exist. So, but likewise, I couldn't imagine that the entire thing was fictional. I had this inkling that the story was so complex. It was not written as fiction, because a lot of it is embarrassing. They have to cover it up, you know, because it's so embarrassing. Why would you write an embarrassing story that you immediately, you know, have to cover the thing up, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament? So it struck me that there should be some history behind it. But people don't study it as history. I had this argument with a historian who they basically sort of disregard the whole of the biblical story, because it's not history. And I said to the guy, you know, if you were digging in Egypt and you found this old amphora in Egypt that was 3,000 years old, and it had these documents inside, would you just throw it away because it mentions God? Or would you study it and try and see what it's actually trying to tell you?
I would hope
the real
people would
history
study
behind it. Yeah, the trouble is you get theologians will study the Bible and they know nothing about history, and then you get historians will study history but know nothing about the biblical text. And so there is no one to really conjoin the two, except for when I came along. And it struck me, as I said before, that there was some real history there. And as soon as I started looking at it, I started to find real history. The first one I discovered, really, I suppose, was in my first book, which is Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, which actually started in the Old Testament, not the New Testament, because the first thing I studied and looked at was the Exodus, and discovered that there was a historical Exodus, which nobody had told me about, and probably not told all of your listeners about either. So there is a historical Exodus. It's known as the Exodus of the Hyksos people out of Egypt.
Okay.
And as I studied this particular piece of history, real history, it struck a chord, because it's identical to the biblical Exodus. In every respect, it's identical.
Except for I mean, renaming certain individuals, like how did you pronounce that?
Hyksos. Well, some people call it the Hyksos. Manetho says you can pronounce it either way, so I call it the Hyksos.
And that has to do with the Israelites being pharaohs, as you've mentioned before?
Yeah, so the Israelites, and this is probably why it's being covered up, because the net result is it means that the Israelite patriarchs were pharaohs of Egypt. They were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, who were an immigrant population. They'd come down from Haran, they'd come down from Mesopotamia, they'd invaded Egypt, they'd taken over Egypt and established their own dynasty of pharaohs. And they were substantially Egyptianized by the end of the time that they were there. They were there for some 400 years or more. Excuse me. And a lot of the names that they have are very similar. They're very biblical. So we have pharaohs called Jacobah,
which would be like Jacob.
It's Jacob, because obviously in the Aramaic his name is Jacob.
Yeah.
Jacob. So we have very similar names. And then we have very similar events. So we have essentially the plagues. We have storms and darkness for 3 days. We have a great ash fall. That's not actually well known as being one of the plagues. But anyway, one of the plagues was the great ash fall that covered the whole of Egypt. That was present at the Hyksos time, as well as the biblical one.
What was
and
interesting?
Then there was,
I don't mean to interrupt. Stan told me something really interesting about the ash thing, being that you related it to possibly being the manna that the Israelites were eating. And
no, I don't think that was me. I relate that to Santorini.
Okay.
So at this time when this happened, the island of Santorini, or Thera, exploded. It was the largest explosion in the Mediterranean basin over the last 5,000 years. And it covered the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean in ash. And we know it did because they've discovered it in, archaeological digs, and you can find the layer of ash there. So we know it covered Egypt and the Levant and Asia Minor. So it was a huge, great eruption. And essentially, that's the story of the plagues. You have the pillar of fire and smoke, that's the volcano. You have the great ash fall. Well, that was the pumice that was falling down from the eruption. And then you have the parting of the waters, which is a perfect description of a tsunami, because this was a maritime volcano, and so it caused a tsunami. And as you know, in a tsunami, the sea disappears, and so you can walk out along the beach and catch all the fish that are just flopping around on the beach, and 15 minutes later the whole of great wall of water comes back in again, and it sweeps the Egyptian army to its death. And that's exactly what happened. And this is what's known as and also the ash fall. I like the description here because it's a very good description. It says that God said to Moses, gather handfuls of ash from the hearth of the fire and scatter it up towards the heavens, and it will fall as a small dust across the whole land of Egypt. There could be no better description of the long-range fallout from a volcano. And that's exactly what happened. So what we have here is what has become recently known as a black swan event. In fact, 4 or 5 black swan events. So a black swan event being something that is so unbelievable, so unexpected, that nobody could make it up. It was named after when they went to Perth in Australia and they found swans that were black. I mean, who could imagine a swan that was black?
Yeah.
Nobody had ever thought of it before. And so, if someone in England back in the 12th century had mentioned black swans, you've got to think, well, there's something strange there, Well, in this Exodus story, we've got 4 or 5 of these black swans. So we have the pillar of fire and smoke, we have the ash fall, we have the 3 days of darkness, and we have the tsunami. For all of those elements to be linked to one historical event, one biblical event, it has to be an eyewitness account of the eruption of Thera. And so that is the basis of the Exodus. That's the whole basis of that chapter in the whole of the beginning of the Torah, that it was an eyewitness account of the eruption of Santorini. So that sent me on the way to thinking that, that there is real historical information within this text. The only trouble for theologians is that this happened in 1600 BC. So it's like 400 years too early for
right.
their classical dating of the Exodus. So A, it's in the wrong era, and B, it means the Israelites were Egyptians. Hyksos Egyptians. And they don't really want that. They don't want to be Egyptians. They're Israelites. They're nothing to do with Egypt. The Egyptians were the evil pharaohs that, kept them in slavery and threw them out of Egypt.
Well, I mean, that's super interesting. And when you talk about the idea of revisionary theology, where you're talking about placing the biblical story back into historical record, that is fascinating to me, because I kind of feel like how you came to the determination that there is truth, but it's just misconstrued. It's like displacing events, changing locations, changing times, because as you said, it's too intricate to make up, like, completely. So it makes sense to do what you're doing. That's, I'm so fascinated by your work, man.
And Ralph, you consider yourself an independent outsider, correct? You're not.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And does your history as a Mason give you access to certain things? And also, I want to also ask you about the Wikipedia arbitration.
Yes, we've had some fun with Wikipedia. Yeah, I am a Mason, but I would have to say that modern Masonry does not know its origins very well. So to put it this way, I became an instructor of fellow Masons as to the history of Masonry, because they didn't know the origins of their own craft, as they call it. So
there weren't higher up initiatives that might have had that information that didn't give it to lower level initiatives, the way that I kind of understand it.
Yeah, that's always the claim. That's always that's always the worry, as it were. But I spoke to people who were had been through the chair at Grand Lodge in London, and they did not know what I knew, and yet they had been master of the lodge down at Grand Lodge in London.
Wow.
And they did not seem to know all of these details. And so I ended up as an instructor on Masonic history. So I get the impression that a lot of this information has been lost. I know the Knights Templar had it. I've got pretty secure information there that the Knights Templar knew all of this. But somewhere between there and here, so the Knights Templar were eradicated in 1307. Friday the 13th, of course, that's why Friday the 13th is unlucky for some, because they were all rounded up and killed on Friday the 13th, 1307.
I didn't know that.
The Templars definitely knew about this.
Would you say that go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Would you say that a lot of this information, if we had access to the Vatican Library, the information you have would be paralleled to?
That would be interesting. I mean, everyone speculates about what it has there. I do wonder what the Catholic Church kept and what they destroyed. The trouble is, the heretical texts might have been so heretical that they just destroyed them anyway, and so they just don't exist anymore. There are things like the history of the kings of Judah by I forget his name now. There was a compatriot of Josephus Flavius who was writing at the same time in the first century, and he wrote of history of the kings of the Israelites and the Jews all the way up until the 1st century. Now that history is not extant. It's gone. We know it existed because Josephus Flavius makes a big fuss about it and says how terrible it was and how incomplete and how biased it was. So we know this book exists at that time, but we don't have a copy of it. Would the Vatican Library have kept such a book, that was very explosive, that certainly undermined what Josephus Flavius said because he hated it? Would they have kept that sort of book? I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out, though. It'd be very interesting to find out.
I would love to find out what is in the Vatican Library. And there's a lot of talks about
Justus of Tiberius. That's right. It was written by Justus of Tiberius. And it no longer exists, unfortunately.
And it's so, you have come across some very interesting information. Like what you mentioned about the Israelites and Egypt and Pharaohs. It's definitely fascinating. And then some of your books talk about Cleopatra to Jesus, where you actually mention based off of your research and findings, and I'm an open-minded skeptic, and it's almost as if you're catering to my type of person, because you're trying to back everything up as much by actual factual evidence, which I really like to have. And so you're claiming that Jesus is the great grandson of Cleopatra the Seventh.
Yes.
And that would be the child of her and Julius Caesar.
Yes, of Julius Caesar.
So they had a son, which was Caesarius, and then when Julius Caesar was assassinated, she fled Rome. I got your information about the historian Cicero, who mentions things about Cleopatra the Seventh being pregnant, hoping that she lost the baby, the scion of the Caesar, and then there's that child just kind of gets erased from history. There's no other technical mention, and then I'm assuming Cleopatra later got with Mark Antony, and then they had Cleopatra's Selene. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Helios and Selene. Yeah.
So
with Mark Antony.
She had 2 children with Mark Antony?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you kind of have, you've written this book, Jesus of Edessa, and going into kind of separating the biblical Jesus and separating the historical Jesus, and finding the parallels, and how almost like what you mentioned with the displacement of time with the Exodus, very similar situation, where like it seemed like a lot of this based off of your research, and even stuff that seems historical, that the events of Jesus took place during the Jewish revolt, but per the Bible, it would have taken place like 45 years before the Jewish revolt. And you cite a lot of very interesting information. I'd kind of like to pick up. Before we get into it, Stan did ask you about the Wikipedia thing. And before you get into the Wikipedia thing, I do want to let you know that once we're done with this, I can get you in contact with a platform called Everypedia, which is is trying to become a decentralized version of Wikipedia. And
well, that might be interesting.
I can get you someplace you can get your information up at.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Wikipedia has become blighted by censorship, basically. This goes back to what we were talking about, the Hyksos, because that was the piece of information I was trying to put onto Wikipedia. We've just looked at the similarities between the history of the Hyksos and the history of the Israelites. And it so happens that Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian, he was in the 1st century, he wrote a complete history of the Jews. It's a sort of a companion to the Old Testament, basically. It goes all the way back to the Adam and Eve and so on, and it gives the whole history of the Jews. And he used... it's called Antiquities.
Okay.
By Josephus Flavius. And he used a Torah, or a Tanakh, that was much earlier than the present one we have. I mean, the present Tanakh we have is only 1,000 years old, about 1000 AD. And earlier than that, we have the Greek version, the Septuagint, which is about 2,300 years old. Josephus was using one from 2,700 years old. So he had a much older Tanakh that he was using to write his book, Antiquities. And one of the things he mentions is actually in another book of his, Against Appian. One of the things he mentions is that the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, he calls them our people. So Josephus Flavius specifically says that the Hyksos exodus out of Egypt was the Israelite exodus out of Egypt. He says they are one and the same. So he is saying that the Israelite patriarchs were pharaohs of Egypt. And that's, what Judaism's greatest historian says. So I thought this would be interesting to put it onto Wiki. So knowing Wiki is very particular about what you write on Wiki. all I tried to do was put in one sentence saying, Josephus says that, you know, the Hyksos Exodus and the biblical Exodus are the same. Here is the quote from Josephus. And we put that in, and it was deleted, of course. And this went on and on. It probably got deleted about 12 times, maybe more, in this great long battle to try and get this little piece of information into Wiki. And they would not have it. And they made every excuse under the sun to stop it going in. And eventually they said, you cannot have quotes from Josephus Flavius because he's unreliable, you know. But of course, if you look around Wikipedia for the history of anything that happens in first century Judea or later, anything to do with the Jews, every article on Wiki has a quote from Josephus Flavius in it. Yeah. Because he's the only historian of that era, pretty much, you know. So there are thousands and thousands of quotes from Josephus Flavius on Wiki. And yet they would not have that one little quote from Josephus, who said that the Israelites were pharaohs of Egypt. They just would not have it. And yeah, Wiki has become infected by these gatekeepers, they call them, who have control over each page. So I can put anything onto a page, no problem. But there is a gatekeeper who looks after each page, and they obviously scan each update. And anything they don't like, they throw off. And
was there ever any resolves from 2017 when you've been through arbitration so far? I mean,
yeah, I got banned from Wiki.
Wow.
That was the result.
That was the result. Yeah, they banned me and the other person who was trying to. I had this colleague who knew how Wiki worked and knew all the rules of Wiki, which I didn't know. And he got banned as well. So,
that's crazy.
Yeah.
But, you know, what I will tell you, though, Ralph, is that incident that took place with Wikipedia, that is become more widespread on multiple different platforms, social media, YouTube. I mean, anybody who's trying to expose truth or trying to be like an independent journalist is dealing with censorship, shadow banning, complete demonetization of their channels, like not allowing them to make money out their channels.
I found it very strange because it's not as if we were inventing something. This was not a hypothesis. This was not half-baked. It was a simple quote from history, which is what sort of Wikipedia is supposed to be about. And yet they still censored it and banned it. So even though, you know, we were presenting something that was historical, they would not allow it onto Wiki. So if you go onto Wiki now, I think the chap I was working with managed to put it into a subsection. So when you go onto Wiki now, onto the Exodus page, it has a section about similarities with the biblical account or something.
Okay.
And it's not in there. But if you click on the subsection and go to another page, I think he's managed to add it into that second page. And it's literally, it's 4 lines of text. That's all we were arguing about.
And it's crazy that they would say that just Josephus wasn't a reliable source, because, I mean, being that he was one of the only historians, and a lot of the information that he's written can be backed up and verified and things like that. So it's not as if he's an imaginary person or writing about imaginary things. I mean, he seemed to be very tight with the Romans. He seemed to be, you know, very much a part of that community. You know, it's stuff that we can kind of fast forward to here in a moment. But I would definitely like to get a little bit of like how you came about discovering and I know it went through a process, but how you led up to finding out about this Jesus, King of Edessa.
Yes.
And how I guess it would all start with Cleopatra the Seventh. And
no, it actually started with my first book. I mean, it's been a gestation. It's taken 25 years to find who Jesus was. It started with Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs. And it was titled that because I could see the links going back into Egypt. You know, we've already seen the links there for the Exodus going back into Egypt, making the Israelites, Egyptians, everything is linked back to Egypt. And so it seemed obvious that if you're going to look for the biblical Jesus, you need those links back to Egypt as well. As it says, you know, out of Egypt I have called my son. Jesus had his education in Egypt. That's where he went to for his education. So if you're going to, and he, in the Gospels and in the works of Josephus, he's known as the Egyptian false prophet. Now, the priesthood aren't going to tell you that, because they try and hide the Egyptian false prophet. But if you read it, it's so obvious. It's obvious to a 6-year-old, because it was the Egyptian false prophet who took the 4,000 out into the wilderness. Now, who was the guy who took the 4,000 out into the wilderness? You know, it's obvious that the Egyptian false prophet was the biblical Jesus. And so in that era, in the 1st century, he was known for being an Egyptian. And it's only by understanding. Yep.
And you had mentioned he has a Persian and Egyptian royal bloodline, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, he did, but I didn't find the Persian bit until much.
It's Greco-Roman, Persian, Egyptian.
Yes, it's the whole lot. Yeah.
It would be like really a kind of a joiner of kingdoms in a way.
Absolutely. He was the perfect king for the known world, because he had the bloodline of Persia and Egypt and Judea and the whole of Rome, and Greece. You know, he was the perfect king to sort of unite the whole of the known world at that time, which is why he was so famous and so dangerous, as it were, to the Romans.
How can you wipe an entire country and culture out of existence when people have written about, like Josephus has written about Edessa?
Yeah.
I think he used a different word.
But history is written by the winners.
Well, I mean, look at what's going on right now, right? I mean, what are they doing right now, right before our eyes?
Yes.
They're taking down the statues. And what have they done? Right just before every war, just before every war in history, they burn the books, they killed it, they take down the statues, and then they put them in, I guess you could say, concentration camps to rewrite the consciousness of history.
I can prove that has been done, because, I mean, this came at the end of my 25 years of investigation, not the beginning, but you can prove it by getting the works of Josephus and all of the Gospels, of course, because it's telling the same story, and just do a word search for Edessa, and it will say nothing found. And then you can put in the kings of Edessa, Abgarus, Manu, Esus, and it will say nothing found. Now, how did that happen? Because Edessa, and I can prove that Edessa.
And there's coinage from Edessa, right?
Sorry?
There is coinage from Edessa, correct?
Oh yeah, it's a real place. We have the history, we have the palace, we have the city, we have the coins, we have the kings. But in the works of Josephus, it's been deleted. It is not there. It has been utterly deleted from history. And
now, you mentioned, was it Josephus that canceled that history? Was he the one who? Yeah, okay.
Because he was working for the Romans. His patron
was ordered by Vespasian to delete this history, basically, and to change it and falsify and take away. That's why it had to be mixed with truth and lies.
Yeah, because this was to do with Rome and the Jewish revolt. We're sort of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but it's interesting because it sets the stage for the history that I found previously. That why was this done? Well, there's another strange thing that you can prove to yourself, is who started the Jewish revolt. You know, the Jewish revolt is the biggest thing that's happened in Judea in the last 2,000 years. Well, that and the Bar Kokhba uprising that came a little bit later. And so it's the biggest event in modern Judaism, as it were, rabbinical Judaism. And you look it up on Wiki, perhaps, or even in the reference books, which I've got, and it won't tell you who started the Jewish revolt. It'll mention, you know, one or two of the side characters that were there at the revolt, but it won't say who actually started the revolt. But Josephus Flavius is quite clear that the revolt was started by Esus, Manubazus, and Kenadius of Adiabene. And the only trouble is with those particular kings is they are fictitious. They are not there in the historical record. Nobody knows where they are. They're supposed to be from this place called Adiabene, which is up near Mosul. It's supposed to be Arbela over in Mesopotamia.
Okay.
But that is not mentioned even in modern texts. If you look at Wiki, if you look at anything, it won't say anything about the kings of Adiabene as being the leaders of the Jewish revolt. It might say that they were some, what do you call them, mercenaries who came down and assisted. But no, Josephus Flavius is clear that they led the Jewish revolt. The Jewish revolt was started by these kings and princes when they destroyed the army of Cestius, the Roman army of Cestius in Judea. And the Jewish revolt only ended when these kings were captured by Rome and they were taken to Rome. They were captured by Titus and sent to Rome. So even in the modern reference books, the rationale and the reason for the Jewish revolt is not mentioned. And again, you've got to think, well, that's a bit strange. You know, why should that be? Why are they even now trying to delete and change who actually started the Jewish revolt? Well, what they don't want you to know, and I'm not entirely sure if they know this themselves, is this is all connected to the gospel story. The gospel story is the story of the Jewish revolt. And as you mentioned earlier there, Rice, it's just the dates have been changed. So we have exactly the same situation as the Old Testament and the Exodus, where we saw the date was changed. So the real Exodus was 400 years before, the real Exodus was 400 years before what they say it was. Why do they want to do that? Because they don't want you to know that they were Egyptians. And the easiest way to do that is to take their history away, park it in a different era so you don't know about it. So it actually happened in 1600 BC. So you say it happened in 1250 BC, and then nobody can find that history. You can do as much archaeology as you like down between Egypt and Judea, and you'll never find the Exodus because you're looking in the wrong era. And so they'll say, you know, that, oh, Jericho wasn't destroyed by the Israelites because there was no Jericho in 1250 BC. Thus, you know, the whole of the Old Testament is wrong. You know, the Exodus didn't happen. None of it is true because we cannot find it in the archaeological record.
Right.
But the funny thing is if you look at the archaeology of Jericho, it was destroyed in 1570 BC by the Hyksos, by the very people who we've already identified as being the Israelites. So suddenly we have found the Exodus just by changing the dates a little bit. And the same has happened for the New Testament for exactly the same reason. Rome didn't want you to know who Jesus was. And we'll go into this in a little minute, why this should be so. And so how are you going to delete this person from history? Well, you just change the date. And what they did is they just pushed the history of this person, Jesus, back by 40 years. And that's a specific number that they chose for a specific reason. 40 is a very specific number within the biblical story. It's very Masonic, actually. And so they pushed his history back by 40 years. So that if you look diligently in the AD 30s, you're never going to find this biblical Jesus. Look as hard as you like, and you're never going to find him at all in the historical record because he didn't live then. And that they did that for a real reason, because they didn't want you to know who he was, because he was the leader of the Jewish revolt, and they didn't want anyone praising.
Because it would inspire more people to revolt. It would cause a chain reaction.
Absolutely. The last thing that Rome wanted was another Jewish revolt or a revolt anywhere else in the empire, of course.
Oh, because when that revolt happened, it was like Rome lost all sense of power when all that was going on. It was like Roman law did not apply.
Yep.
It was very interesting. And that was one of the reasons why too, like there was multiple reasons for wanting to bring you on, but the main reason is kind of like what you're saying is there's a lot of things that we have been taught that are not necessarily true. And no matter what we're dealing with in life, human history, religion, government, there's so many things that are hidden from us that we don't know. And I try to encourage people, me and Stan, we both try to encourage people to educate themselves, to do their own research, to use critical thinking, because a lot of the stuff that we're looking into, and the second part of why we wanted to bring you on, is that a lot of people are questioning us questioning history.
Yes, well, they always do. Yeah.
And, but it gets a little crazy. And so I try to let people know that, by us inviting you onto the show, we're not necessarily saying that we believe what you're saying to be true. But I wanted to bring you on because you're an intellectual person. You do not come off as like some crazy cuckoo conspiracy theorist. You seem like a regular old guy. Like there's no one can't look at you and judge you in some way and think that you have some ulterior motive with trying to establish truth. So I think that what you're doing is a great thing for humanity, because you're just showing factual information about where we've been lied to, so that maybe you can inspire other people and it could cause a chain reaction too. And then we can have a bunch of people out here trying to establish the truth and find out exactly what the history is.
I do hope I will inspire people to follow me, because I cannot, for all my wonderful talents, I cannot find out everything that's happened in these books. I mean, they are so voluminous, so much information there, that it needs other people to come along and have take a second look and find the bits that I've missed, because I'm sure there are plenty. It takes someone like myself to do this, because you need to be independent. So, and strangely enough, which I never thought when I started this, I had this big high ideal about science and history and academia as being wonderful independent thinkers, not corrupted by anything.
Mm-hmm.
How wrong was I? Oh well, never mind.
That's probably one of the most insightful things you're going to say in today's conversation, honestly. I think that says a lot right there.
We all knew this about theologians and priests, of course, because they've only got one history to sell, so they can't question it too much, because the whole of their edifice will fall down if they undermine it too much. So you can imagine them having a specific creed that they don't want to let go of. But academia, they should be free thinkers, shouldn't they? But unfortunately not. They are worse, I think, than theologians in sticking to their creed.
I would compare it to today's mainstream news. Because now the mainstream news isn't doing what they're supposed to do, and the independent journalists are now the news, and you as an alternate historian are establishing the history. So I think that the paradigm is starting to shift a little bit. Hopefully we are entering into some sort of age of enlightenment where we're going to progress as humanity. That would be a beautiful thing to see us start to step up and kind of get our humanity back a little bit.
Yeah, I do despair and worry a little bit, because, as I say, this information was known in the 14th century by the Knights Templar, and yet we managed to lose it. So we can go backwards if we're not careful. And we know this information was known to the Knights Templar because they wrote Arthurian history. The last of my books is the Grail Cypher. And because when I was going through this history, I kept finding little bits of Arthurian history within the story.
King Arthur time period, right? Okay.
There was lots of similarities with the Arthurian story. So I went back and did a whole research program on Arthurian legend and found a very, very different King Arthur to the one that anyone knows about. He was not the character that anyone has written about before. So my book on King Arthur is unique, absolutely unique. But one of the things it did was it proved that in that era, a lot of this information was known. So we were just talking about what I call the chronological chasm, the 40-year gap between accepted biblical history of Jesus and the real history of Jesus. So the accepted is he died in AD 30, but he didn't. He died in AD 70 at the hands of the Romans. Well, that was known in Arthurian history. So in Arthurian history, one of the chief heroes, of course, of Arthurian history is Joseph of Arimathea, the guy who took Jesus down from the cross.
Right.
And so there's a bit of a dichotomy here between Jesus and Joseph, you know, but nevertheless, that's part of the story. And so we have a lot of information, Arthurian information about Joseph of Arimathea. And one of the things it says is that, one of the interesting things it says is that Joseph of Arimathea was the traitor. So Judas was innocent. It wasn't Judas, it was Joseph of Arimathea who shopped Jesus to the Romans, which is hugely heretical. I don't know how they managed to get away with that in the 14th century anyway, but that's what they wrote. But the other thing that they wrote is that Joseph of Arimathea worked for Emperor Vespasian. Now that's a problem.
Joseph of Arimathea worked for Vespasian?
Yeah, he was a soldier who worked
because he was the commander at the time, right? He wasn't the emperor.
No, he became emperor in AD 70. So yeah, he worked for Emperor Vespasian in AD 71, AD 70, when he became emperor. And that's a problem because, you know, Joseph of Arimathea is this saintly guy who appears from nowhere and takes Jesus down from the cross in AD 30. But Arthurian legend says that he worked for Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian, for 7 years, which is like in AD 70s. How do you square that one?
Right.
Well, they understood, you know, that the writers of Arthurian legend understood they had a problem here. So the way they get around it is they say that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross. And then he gets captured and thrown into prison. This is Joseph of Arimathea, gets thrown into prison. And he goes to sleep for 3 days in prison and wakes up 40 years later. And not a day has passed. And he looks exactly the same as he did when he went to sleep 40 years earlier. And he's woken up in this beautiful illumination, this flash of inspiration, woken up by Emperor Vespasian, who comes down into his cell. And so now we can jump this chronological chasm and we can get Joseph of Arimathea from the AD 30s up into the AD 70s by making him go to sleep for 3 days. So they knew that there was a chronological chasm between the established date for, you know, the crucifixion of Jesus and the real date for the crucifixion of Jesus. This was well known in the 13th and 14th century AD. We can prove that. And yet that information appears to be lost. I don't know anyone today who knows that information. Yeah, I was the first person to write about this back in 1997, long before Einhorn and various other people have started writing about this. Atwill have started writing. We're getting a confluence of ideas now because this information has come out, and we're getting more and more people who are looking at the Jewish revolt Vespasian era for the Gospels. The latest one, which I thought was a very good book.
No,
I'll have to look it up.
Real quick, if I recall, do I recall you mentioning correctly that you've traveled to these countries that the books that weren't destroyed, the other books of the Bible, if you will, or scriptures that weren't destroyed, you've traveled there and you've been in them and read them and seen them.
Did you do any archaeology type work, or were you just like more visiting these places you were writing about?
Not being an archaeologist, I can't actually do the archaeology, but I can, because, you know, they're written up fairly well. A lot of these archaeological digs, you can get the information. So I've traveled to all of these places. And I've, discovered things there that I wouldn't have discovered here. And so I've been all around, Eastern Turkey, which is where Edessa is, all over Syria and the Levant, all over Judea, of course, and Jordan, all of those places. And that you have to do that in your research, because you have to put yourself in that environment to see what it's like. And you do come across things that are not in the tourist guides. They're not even in the historical books sometimes. And so it was when I was out in Turkey, as it were. Was it Turkey or Syria? Anyway, I found this book on the Eastern Church. It was it was about the Armenians who had been kicked out of and obviously murdered by the Turks during the great Armenian genocide of the 20s. Very sad time. And that contained a lot of information which I had not seen before. That was very useful. And I also got a copy of the Syriac historian, Moses of Corinne, which I had not seen before. I mean, it is available over here if you had found it, but I happened to find it in a bookstore over there. So there was a lot of that information that came out of my travels. It allows you to put the story together, because I'd never heard of these places. There's a very strange thing is that my books are not structured. I don't have a book to write. I start writing and the book slowly forms. So when I started writing that book about Jesus, King of Edessa, I had never even heard of Edessa when I started writing that book. So when I started writing that book on my computer, even now, it's actually called Helena, is the name of the book, because that's what I was writing about. I was writing about this famous queen, or I'm not sure if she's famous or not to your viewers, but the famous queen known as Queen Helena of Judea, first century character.
Which is known as Mary, right? Which is known as Mary?
No, she would have been the mother of Mary.
Mother of Mary, yeah.
Hold on. No, you're right. Yes. Queen Helena would have been Mary. Yes, you're right. Sorry.
Mary Magdalene or Mary the
Mary the Virgin.
Mother?
Yeah, Mary the mother.
Was there a virgin story to that?
Yeah, they were all virgins because they were Vestal virgins. I mean, it was a very well-known position. Even within Judea, they had Vestal virgins who worked at the temple. And the Vestal virgins could leave later and get married. So yes, of course, a Vestal virgin could have children. But in a way, they were also a perpetual virgin because they were all regarded as incarnations of Isis. And so Isis is, the goddess of fertility and the goddess of the celestial heavens. And
does that relate back to like Inanna or anything like that?
Well, not so much. Well, I suppose it could be. I don't link them too much towards the Persian gods, mainly back to Egypt, because I think all of the gods came out of Egypt and Persia was subsidiary to Egypt, not the other way around. I know a lot of historians put it the other way around, but I think it was all founded in Egypt and it went to Persia.
When you refer as Persia, you're referring to like Mesopotamia and Samaria? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's changed names so many times, it's difficult. At the time, it was known as Parthia, but not many people know that region as Parthia. But yeah, Mesopotamia.
Okay.
But before we get too far off of Helena, just to clear up, now you've mentioned that Mary is actually a title for bishop.
Yes. Yeah, so Mary is a title. All of these characters had titles, which makes it very difficult sometimes to track the history because you can get multiple characters with the same name, of course. Another one is Peter. Peter is a title. It wasn't his name. His name was Simon, but he was given the name Peter and Kephas, meaning the stone. Because he was the keeper of the sacred stone, and we'll go into that later. So you get a lot of these characters with well-known titles that you tend to think is a person. Another famous one is Galahad in Arthurian legend, And everyone says, oh, yes, the character known as Galahad. Well, Galahad was a title. It wasn't a name. And so they have at least 2 or 3 Galahads within Arthurian legend. One of them was Lancelot and the other one was Percival. And yeah, the same happens in biblical history as well. We get a lot of these titles around. Jesus and Christ are titles. That's not his name.
Boom, there we go.
Yeah, Christ means.
So before we kind of move forward, so because some people who I know are going to be watching this or watching this because of Greg Hallett, and we're going to get into the Greg Hallett stuff, but since we kind of like are here and talking about words, I'd like to get your idea of like what the words like Messiah, Mashiach, what those mean, what Christ means. Because there's a lot of confusion around those words.
Yeah, they've taken on meaning like words do. You know, they become names, they become something special and spiritual. But Messiah and Christ are very simple terms. Essentially, it just means king or priest king. So people like King David and Solomon were known as the Messiah. So was the Persian king, Nebuchadnezzar. He was called the Messiah because it just means a special king. It means the anointed king. And obviously, Nebuchadnezzar got anointed because he conquered Judea. And obviously, David and Solomon were both anointed.
That's where the Israelites became captive by the Babylonians, and
yeah, that's right.
That's where we get the Babylonian Talmud and things like that come from that. Okay.
Yeah, that's another thing that's not known about very much is the whole of Iraq was mostly Jewish up until 1947, 1950s.
Yeah, it was once Israel was established as a nation, weren't they like basically kicked out?
Yeah, well, they were kicked out several times by the Romans twice, and by the Persians and not exactly kicked out by the Greeks. They were taken over by the Greeks, but during the Babylonian exile, they were exiled to modern Iraq, to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, and they were very successful there. And they established their own line of kings, Jewish kings, in Iraq, and they ran Iraq. Jews are obviously very resourceful. Wherever they end up, they normally end up controlling the money supply and various things like that. And they controlled Iraq, and they had their own king of Iraq right up until 1947 when they were all kicked out. And was it 47 or 57 when they were all kicked out?
47 sounds right, because that's when Israel, I think, was
made.
Yes,
it was 47. And the last king of Iraq was a Jewish king called Niam Dangor. And he was kicked out in the 1960s.
Yeah, he was pictured with British royalty. And
that's right. He lives in London. I'm not sure if he's still alive, actually, because that was a long time ago. But anyway, he used to live in London.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so that's another little bit of untold history, is that Iraq was substantially
how did the Messiah, Mashiach, Christ, how did all this get jumbled up into Son of God, God in the flesh?
Because they wanted this king to be something special. Whereas, in effect, every king would have been anointed, just the same as Queen Elizabeth II was anointed. She is the Messiah. She is the Christ. She was anointed at her coronation. And Jesus was anointed at his coronation, which was at the house of Bethany, the house of Simon.
Peter Simon?
It was Simon Boethus. So yeah, not Peter. This is another Simon. Okay. This was Simon Boethus, who was the richest man in Judea, and it was in the gospel story. It's the house of Mary and Martha, who lived at the house of Simon.
Okay.
And it was Mary, of course, that anointed Jesus with the very expensive oil of spikenard.
And that would be
and
Mary
everyone
Magdalene.
Sort of looks at that. Yeah, Mary and Martha was Mary Magdalene. And everyone looks at this little section and says, yeah, okay, yes, I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, but something happened, and, Mary Magdalene poured some oil on him, but, nothing of significance, really. But of course, it's of huge significance. This was his coronation as the King of the Jews. That's why he's known as the King of the Jews, because he was crowned as king. But because he didn't have a throne to sit on, and we'll go through why this was later, he didn't have a throne to sit on because he didn't have control of Jerusalem. And so they had this private ceremony in the house of Simon, which I think was at Bethabara, which is actually in modern Jordan. It wasn't close to Jerusalem. It was actually across the River Jordan. And they had a private ceremony where he was crowned the king of Edessa and of the Jews. Now, the reason they did this was because this must have been about AD 50s or so, and his father had just died. And of course, he didn't want to lose his status. As you know, when a king dies, there's always a scramble between the various sons as to who's going to be the next king. He wanted to make his mark and become the next king. So they had this private ceremony in the house of Simon, and he became the Messiah, the anointed one, the anointed king. And Christ means exactly the same, the anointed one. So he became the anointed priest king of Judea and Edessa. And we know he became the anointed king of Judea because his mother, Queen Helena, we're back to the famous Queen Helena again, was effectively the queen of Judea. And again, they won't tell you about this because they don't want to admit it. There's the number of things they just cover up by just not mentioning it. But in the AD 50s, the de facto monarch of Judea was Queen Helena. She owned the largest palace in Jerusalem and the largest tomb in Jerusalem, which is still there. And she furnished the Temple of Jerusalem. I mean, there was nothing in the Temple of Jerusalem. She furnished it. The great gold menorah, which was the central artifact in the temple, was bought by Queen Helena. That was the wealth that she brought with her. And so she became the de facto queen of Judea.
After Jesus?
No, this was before. Well, probably in a co-regency in a way. I think he would have been crowned probably at about the same time.
Because there were two brothers. You mentioned he was kind of made a de facto king of the Jews.
Well, yes, because he wasn't recognized. This was the whole problem. This was the whole point of the Jewish revolt, is he wanted recognition as the true king of the Jews. So when he's talking to Pontius Pilate, he's obviously not talking to Pontius Pilate. It was a later era. That's the only thing in the New Testament that has changed, is they've dropped Pontius Pilate into the story. It would have been a later governor, of course. Okay. Everything else in the gospel story is to do with the AD 50s and 60s. But when it says, you know, do you call yourself a king of the Jews? And he says sort of, well, you said it, you know, and all of that.
Right, he never actually says it himself.
No, because it would have been politically, if he had been captured and he was sitting there being tried by the governor, it would have been not very expedient to say, you know, I've taken over your country, chaps, you know. I know you're going to disagree with that, but I've taken over your country. So he's just being diplomatic, of course. But the whole goal was to take over Judea. That was the whole point of the exercise. Edessa, we'll come back to this, how he became the kings of Edessa. But Edessa is up in the north. It's in the north of Syria. And so they controlled northern Syria. They controlled eastern Syria at Palmyra. They probably controlled all the way down to Aleppo. But they didn't control Judea. And so if you want to take over the Roman East, you've got to control that region as well. You want Jordan and Judea as being a part of your realm as well. And that was the whole idea, was to take over that part of the Roman Empire.
What I would say about that one is that is super fascinating. And what we're going to do with this video and how we're going to release it is we're going to probably put it out on the same day in multiple parts.
Yep.
So what I'd like to do, like right here, we can kind of do like a little break, and we'll
a little break, yeah, and start again. Yep.
We'll continue the video because that way it gives people time. Because if they see a 2-3 hour long interview, it may be
daunting, isn't it?
Yeah, like I can't commit myself to this time. So if we split it up into a couple different parts, I think that would make it easier for people to digest. And this will give us a chance here to pause and then reconvene the video. So if you're watching this, make sure you're sticking around for the next part and possibly the next part after that.